Hello everyone, welcome to my SREcon keynote talk. My name is Niall Murphy and I have brought you to the Phoenix Park in Dublin, Ireland, which is apparently the largest enclosed park in a capital city in Europe, or so they tell me. I've brought you here so you can experience some of the peace and tranquility that comes from being in a natural environment such as this, because what I have to say to you is neither peaceful nor tranquil. But let's get the easy bits and the history out of the way first. So, the reason I'm talking to you is this thing here, which is 5.5 years old, or in or around from time of publication by the time you watch this talk. I'm still proud of it, and I owe an immense debt of gratitude to my co-workers Jennifer Petoff, Chris Jones and Betsy Byer, without whom none of this would actually have happened. So I owe them an eternal debt, and thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about what the book, how the book came to be, what it meant, and some of its impact and its legacy. And I want to distinguish between impact and legacy, because I think those things are actually potentially quite separate, or at least it's useful to separate them in this context. There were a couple of difficulties and challenges and so on we experienced in making the book. I think the first thing to say is there were over 70 contributors to this, so it's kind of like a giant MapReduce or a giant set of parallel jobs. Just the logistics of keeping that ticking over, making sure that the work product got delivered on time, and rating it, assessing it, rewriting if necessary, aligning, all of that kind of stuff was just, I mean, it's a lot of infrastructural overhead, but you do that because it's the most effective way of getting a large project done and parallelized, and it suited how we wanted to present the material, which is a set of different viewpoints. We almost came a cropper at one stage when it turned out that, it looked like the head of PR for Google at that time, Rachel Whetstone, would have to read all 560 something pages of the book prior to launch in order to make sure that it was brand aligned, brand compatible, and so on and so forth. Thankfully, we and she avoided that fate when we shipped a draft version to Urs Heusel, who's engineering SVP in Google, the Christmas before we were due to publish in kind of spring 2016. So this is December 2015. We shipped him a copy which he read over the holidays, and he declared it was 20% too long and we had to cut it, which in retrospect I agree with, but at Christmas, or at that time, I was a little challenged by having to make those edits at short notice. If you've heard of the book at all, if you're watching this talk because you're interested in the book, it's probably because of the one course metric, coarse but useful, which is sales. The SRE Book, whatever else you say about it, it sold absolutely like hotcakes. The publishing companies in general, I suppose, tend to be a bit sensitive about numbers, so I won't go into details here, but there's some notional figure which is a bestseller in the technical book community, and the SRE Book sold many, 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 many times that number. It did very, very well. My sense is it clearly met some need, which we'll come back to later on in the talk. I suppose I hint at a certain amount of this at the DevOps and SRE chapter in the workbook, where I say that operations as an activity has just been terrible, more or less, forever. Like, very difficult to get right, very difficult to balance correctly, so on and so forth. And I think the SRE Book was one of the first ones, not one of the first ones, but was one of the most widely read ones that attempted to take a new approach to this. I suppose the primary one, certainly the first one that came out that we had to deal with, was questions of tone, questions of arrogance, and so on. I'm not sure that any book by Google could really escape those accusations, certainly not at that time period. I will say that this wasn't anything intentional on behalf of the authors. I'm sympathetic to the accusation. I understand how it can come across like that. I mean, Google, or more or less any significantly sized multinational, tech multinational, is kind of a totalizing environment in and of itself. It is very much a bubble. I will say that one of the first strongly negative reactions that I came across was actually one of the first reactions to the book, and I'm scrolling through Twitter reading this negative reaction at the side of my eldest's football match at the time, and I'm almost in tears going, oh no, the book is going to be a failure, etc., etc. Well, it didn't turn out to be that, as it happens, but I think part of the reason for that is that even though the tone and arrogance and so on, perceived arrogance, can annoy people, there's still material of value inside it, and I'm glad that that's the case. I'm glad that it's possible to take away useful stuff from it, even if it doesn't quite match with how you want to work. I think the second criticism is closely related to that, which is some of the DevOps controversy, where a number of folks in the community felt that we were kind of striding onto the stage saying, look at these amazing things we've done, and not referring to the fact that lots of other people had thought like this, had been like this before, and so on. Again, I'm sensitive to this. This is partially why we write the chapter about DevOps and SRE in the workbook, to make this clear that we are aware of our antecedents, and we do honor them. I certainly don't regard it as a blocker for the communities relating to each other, and I think actually that a lot of this controversy, again, as Charity Majors says, is just made up. Slightly more relevant, in some sense, accusation is that the book is not a complete manual, or the SRE model relies on things that aren't written down in the book. This is absolutely unquestionably true. It's not just true because we had to cut 20% of it at the last moment, including, various articles that had been actually published elsewhere. I suppose the best example of that is the hiring chapter. The book, therefore, provides an incomplete view of the life cycle of an SRE, life cycle of a team, life cycle of organizational adoption, some of which we try to put into the workbook. You can't really look at the book and go, okay, this is a blueprint, like just do this and you'll be fine, which is a very key point I want to come back to later. I don't think there's anything in the book that you can say, just do this and you'll be fine. I think the other point to address there is relying on things that aren't written down, not just in the sense of, leaving out a hiring chapter, but in the sense of David Foster Wallace's The Water We Swim In, cultural observation that often the things that are most important to describing or explaining human behavior are the things that aren't talked about in that context. So the cultural substrate required to have Google SRE, to make, quotes, SRE is done in Google, end quotes, wasn't described effectively. It's the water we swim in. It's the totalizing environment. It's the things that we assume are true because everyone behaves that way and no one behaves any other way. But it's crucial, of course. And when you go to different environments, like, things break down. If you have a strongly oppositional territorial environment, it makes it harder, much harder to enable the kind of fluid cross-org, cross-business unit, cross-code base day-to-day activities of SRE is done in Google, and as a result, the model in its entirety is kind of hard to copy and paste elsewhere. It's hard to get that horizontal glue across vertical silos role that has been so effective and so distinctive for Google SRE when the silos are just that bit more tightly defended. Which is not to say that there's not silos in Google or elsewhere, like there's a lot of them everywhere. But it's really the question of legacy that I want to address from here on in, and goes to the heart of what I want to say in this keynote. The value for having different mental models for how operations can work in an organizational context is, I think, inarguable. I think that's been a net good. Even though successfully working differently continues to be very hard for more or less everyone, the value of having software-founded concepts and vocabulary for these management kind of activities, service management activities, software development activities, developer velocity activities, and so on, all of that is foundational, of course. But I'm going to leave those to one side for a moment and talk about legacy, and is that I think we face a more important and more serious difficulty, which is to say that the vast definitional influence that the SRE book had has now led to a lack of innovation. People have stopped thinking about what it means to manage a service. They've stopped thinking about what they have to do from first principles. There is a lot of copy and paste going on. We, I feel, as a community, as a movement, are now held back by these patterns that were established well over 5 years ago, as I was saying, from publication time. In my view, we need to stop that. We need to intentionally work on improving these models, on answering questions for which today we actually don't have any answers, or we don't have good answers. And we accept those not very good answers today, and I think that's bad. So in order to make that point a little more obviously, I'm going to do something on camera that I'm never going to do again. So pay attention. I love this book. I love all of the people who contributed to it. I think it's brilliant. But it's not good enough. There, I did it. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to, but I did. And if I can, so can you. Having said all that, having done all that, it's important to say this is not free license. This is not licensed to go out and relabel all your operations teams, SREs. It's not licensed to go and do whatever you want. It's not licensed to go and return to old models that also weren't useful, or no models. So the first thing to discuss, I think, is the value of reliability. We are all about the reliability, right? I mean, the clue is in the name. Well, actually, in my view, we have a terrible intellectual story about why reliability matters, and specifically about how much it matters, particularly how much it matters with respect to other things that teams could be doing at that time. What do I mean? Well, I think for me it becomes most sharply clear in the context of justifying reliability work, particularly if it's in competition or opposition to other kinds of work that could be done by a team at that moment. If you read SRE books, read SRE articles, listen to SRE talks, etc., you will see, I believe, that when you are looking for a good model, I mean, ideally numeric, or mechanistic, or something that provides some insight. If you're looking for a model to justify or to say to execs or other folks determining the work of large numbers of people, if you're looking for a model to say, yes, you should do this instead of this, and it's related to reliability, we actually don't have anything. We don't have anything solid we can say. We have a lot of bald assertions. We have a lot of reliability is the most fundamental feature. We have a lot of, if you don't do this stuff, bad things will happen. But we're not really able to describe precisely how much bad stuff and when it's going to happen, and so on and so forth. We have a big gap where we should have a relatively well-explored space and a multi-dimensional model that tells us more or less what's going on. I suppose coming back to this, the most important feature, or the primary feature, is reliability, etc. I'm going to ask you, the viewer, like, is that really true? I mean, is that really true at all times? I mean, if reliability was the most important thing, the most important feature at any moment, then it would be quite literally the most important activity that we would be doing at any one time, and it would win all of the prioritization conversations, which it doesn't. Not out there, not in the real world. Like, I don't have to tell you, the viewer, this. Like, and equally, Google is not a magical land where reliability wins all of the prioritization conversations at any moment. That's just not how it works. But the thing which is most difficult about this is that that space, those trade-offs, reliability and more or less anything else, and I don't just mean features, like I mean security and machine learning and all of the things that you might want software to do for you, all of the things that are hard to make software to do for you, to do. We don't have a good understanding of, we can't even describe that space. We can't even describe those trade-offs. We only have very small hints what that space is like. We don't understand it in any meaningful way. So I would say at this precise moment, how we talk about reliability, how we prioritize reliability, how we do reliability, how we value reliability, a lot of that is socially constructed. We kind of assert reliability is the most important feature. We talk between ourselves and agree on this, but actually we don't have a solid foundation to that assertion. We don't understand the trade-offs, and I think we need to. In some sense, actually, just to say something perhaps even a bit more difficult, I think a lot of the frustration and sometimes even the blindness in the community around this spot, around the value of reliability, flows from the fact that we're often finding ourselves in the position of having conversations with engineering leaders and saying things like, actually, you know, maybe we should tidy up after ourselves, or actually, this thing is going to blow up and it's going to be a problem for us, and we're not being listened to. Like, I suppose it's kind of comforting for us to assert that if the software is down, there's no value to the software. Of course, sure, right? But how often is that measurement, or is that situation a Boolean? How often is there a totally down, totally up situation? How often are questions of reliability really only given organizational focus by a crisis? And having a good model for what reliability means and what trade-offs are being made could help us to articulate the value outside of the context of being a crisis, which I think is vital for us to progress. I have a story. I spoke to an engineering leader a couple of years ago, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 3.5, something like that. A well-known name, household name, not the engineering leader, but the entity he worked for. And I said, so I understand you're in Dublin to look at kind of software engineering capability here. I'm interested in what's your reliability story, because that's kind of the area I'm in. And he said something to me which I've been reflecting on in the 3.5 years, and he said since, and he said, yes, we don't have one. And I said, that's very interesting. Can you tell me more about that? And he said, well, we believe that our users are so sticky that even if the website is down for an extended period of time, they'll have no choice but to come back to us. In other words, we're meaningfully the only game in town. And as a result, we don't need to worry about reliability. And I suppose my first reaction was, actually, let me know how that works out for you. Not 100% sure that that's actually the right way to treat this. But, I mean, I never spoke to that person again. And I can tell you that the household name in question is doing, as far as I can tell, just fine right now. So actually, maybe that was the correct outcome. Like, that was the correct behavior. He didn't care about reliability because his users were sufficiently sticky. Or maybe they're in a worse position than they would have been if they had focused on reliability. They seem to be in a perfectly fine position. I mean, I don't know what the trade-offs are. I suppose I'm frustrated by that conversation because it might well be that it's a useful counterexample to questions about the value of reliability, and turns out reliability has no value, or something equally nihilistic. But my intuition really is, if we could explain this better, we could understand what goes on when we pay attention to reliability and understand the likely consequences of not doing so. Or, as I've sometimes articulated before, so much of the questions of modern software engineering are really, what can you successfully ignore? And in certain cases, we successfully ignore unreliability or reliability, and in some cases we don't. And as I say, I don't think we have a good model for why. Reflecting further on that, we have a couple of hints as to what that possibility space might look like today. There are, for example, a number of pretty well-known studies about the relationship between latency and customer experience, or ordering rate, or interaction with software generally. Those studies pretty much all show the same thing, even though some of those numbers are different from time to time. There's I think Google, Amazon, Zalando all have kind of equivalent studies, and they basically show the more latency, the more users don't use the service, the more they find it frustrating, the more they try and find a substitute product, so on and so forth. It's been reproduced often enough that feels to me like the edge of an elephant in the space, that we could maybe profitably explore some of the edges in order to figure out, or add further dimensions to it in order to figure out what those trade-offs look like. I'm not aware of any similar public work. I hope to, at some stage, become aware of, but I'm not aware of any similar public work that explores relationships with reliability in a strongly numeric way. Another couple of examples, the truly wonderful SRE book shows that we have a data-based reason to believe that stability and frequency of delivery of small batches of software, rapidity of release to production, etc., can in fact go hand in hand. Presumably, I mean, the small batch sizes and the rapidity and so on are related in some sense. Like, that's an equation, right? That's some kind of relationship. That's the beginning of an edge that you could explore in order to figure out what it looks like when you have, a larger batch size, or what you look like when you deliver less frequently, and so on. It's an area for exploration. But I don't really see anyone recommending moving faster after an outage. Instead, what I see is a lot of, okay, we had a big outage, we have to slow things down, we have to move more cautiously, and so on and so forth. And of course, what that does is build up a kind of backlog of changes, which makes it even harder to get the next set of changes through successfully, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of contrary effects which are not well explored, or counterintuitive effects which are not well explored, and we need to do that. In some ways, this is, in my mind, connected to the statement that it's kind of hard to find, in certain ways, it's hard to find an economic argument for simplicity in software. So if we think about this in the following way, that at each individual time step, an engineering leader has a choice to develop a feature which gets money in for the company, or to work on reliability, which does not get money in for the company, or consolidates a higher percentage chance of getting the money in that would already come in if the thing worked perfectly, etc., etc. That question of handling technical debt or technical housekeeping, so on and so forth, it's really not well understood. And when I think about the trade-offs between simplicity, which is so vital for service management, for software development, for long-term concerns, and the fact that you often find yourself spending simplicity for short-term concerns, for revenue accrual and so on, those tensions also feel to me like the edge of a space we could explore profitably. Another question is with respect to economically valuing reliability. Folks often look at the fact that a sufficiently mature system with a lot of dollars flowing through it, etc., you can, generally speaking, arrive at some coarse-grained value of reliability by saying, you know, if this is down, we lose $500 a second or something like that. I think that this provides value under perhaps a kind of insurance or actuarial style model where you can look at the direct accounting effect of downness or missed queries and so on and so forth, but it doesn't provide a total accounting, and in particular it kind of breaks down at the edges. It might well make some kind of sense for saying, all right, you know, there's a 1% chance of this $1 million system dying, therefore we should spend up to 1% of $1 million on offsetting that cost. But actually, that might not be a sensible trade-off at that time, because that's actually a relatively small number when you look at salaries, costs of stuff and so on. And particularly when you look at future revenue numbers, generally speaking, you find that you wish you had spent that money or that effort on reliability earlier on in the cycle of a growing system than if you spent it later when it actually makes kind of direct economic sense to do so. And for those of you who are watching and are saying, but SLOs, don't say SLOs, SLOs have weaknesses too, which is our next piece. So I've spoken about the weaknesses of SLOs and error budget mechanisms before. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. And apologies to the many, many fans of SLOs out there. I really do think there's huge value to them. I particularly think their value is in the social construction of assessment of the value of reliability between the business and engineering, which allows people to, in the first case, not just react all of the time, which is hugely valuable, and second of all, to provide relative prioritization between services, which is hugely valuable. So many, many things that SLOs do, but I see a lot of the value is residing in the organizational layer or the social layer. But as we're getting kind of industry-wide mileage out of them, it's becoming clearer to me that the SLO model has some significant weaknesses. It has a number of assumptions that underlying it that are really pretty problematic. The first one being that it models kind of system behavior in a very natural or kind of useful way, both in the expectations of future behavior and modeling of measurement of past behavior, I should say, and that you can take reasonable action based on SLOs. So to begin with, I suppose a famous statement, I think this is down to Charlie Majors, the nines don't matter if the user isn't happy. I think there's a lot of nuance to the question of what is a happy user, how do we measure that, how do we account for it, and so on, for which SLOs provide some framework. But I want to ask a more fundamental question, which is counting nines and all of that logistic framework actually an effective method of understanding the user experience? Like, to my mind, it's a proxy for the user experience, and there could be more effective proxies. In particular, the question I find myself asking is, do we have any confidence that these kinds of patterns, these power of 10 style patterns, map to a kind of a natural behavior or a pattern which matters with respect to the user experience? Or is it all entirely arbitrary? Like, could we change it to 8s and have more or less the same impact on the user experience? Is it dimensionless or quantityless or something? Or to ask it a different way is, if 9s are so cool, why did we introduce 5s? Like, why do we have 99.95? And the answer is because we wanted to have a more fine-grained way of treating the spectrum of availability and experience for the user. And my extension of that would be, well, if we added 5s, why don't we add other numbers as well? Like, what is it about this infrastructure that maps nicely onto the human experience, or did we just copy and paste it from a previous historical context? Another key weakness of SLOs is that they are good for modeling services that have lots of independent requests and independent similar requests. I suppose a classic request response kind of web paradigm. But there are lots of incredibly valuable services that are outside that paradigm for which SLOs don't work quite so well. And also there are services where the requests are not similar, or they could contain arbitrary complexity. For example, SQL-like services where you could be uploading an extremely complicated string which involves potentially a lot of computation, etc., etc., etc. Like, maybe that's an outlier, maybe it's not, maybe you don't have a kind of normal distribution for your query length, etc. But overall, the way that SLOs handle the situation where actually some queries might be more important than others, or some queries might be legitimately taking more time than others, it's pretty finicky to handle with that model today. And I know a few people who argue it isn't handled that well at all. Another really fundamental and difficult problem is that SLOs, and in particular how we do monitoring and alerting for them right now today, does not distinguish successfully between one 100-minute outage and one 100 one-minute outages. And that's a huge difficulty, because that is the difference between front page of the New York Times, Irish Times, or a couple of people retry a few requests. We don't have a way to successfully model or react to that. Today in monitoring and alerting, I'm not going to say the state of the art necessarily, but the common thing that people do is they have a fast burn and a slow burn alert. I've written on this before. That approach is at least some distance towards kind of acknowledging the fact that the surface area of these things, of these kinds of outages, even though they might be the same in kind of raw numeric terms, are certainly not the same in customer impact terms, which is problematic because that's what SLOs are supposed to help characterize and respond effectively to. Another difficulty, especially with respect to error budgets, is that in theory, the error budget model says that after a significantly large outage, you need to pause because you've paused releases and changes and so on and so forth because you've spent your error budget, and you focus on fixing the thing, and then you move forward once you've fixed the thing. The difficulty, of course, is that sometimes, particularly if you're very unlucky like I have been, or very unskilled, you can have a situation where you blow all of your error budget in one go for the year, which is actually easier than you might think. And theoretically, according to the model, like, you can't release for the rest of the year, but actually that's totally unrealistic. Like, who's going to do that? But let me cover some things that I think flow from taking the book as canon law rather than liturgy, which is to say there's a bunch of things in there which flow from kind of rule of thumb, truncated discussions, let's just do this and move on, or kind of intuitive ideas about what's most effective to do, which have now been copied and pasted into loads of other organizations and loads of how teams work. Some of them, I'm sure, are still valid today in certain circumstances. Some of them have kind of long ago passed their expiry date, but I think we're not reflecting enough on them. Another important thing with respect to SRE as practiced and also as outlined in the book, I suppose, is how important on-call is for SREs to be doing, for anyone to be doing, I suppose. The margin of this talk is not large enough to contain all of my feelings about on-call. I've spoken about it, written about it in other places. But I will say that as well as the viewpoint that SREs are essentially just, quote, competent people who happen to be on call, end quote, which is one view that's been expressed to me, and like really strongly locates the value of SRE within the incident response, incident management domain. The difficulty with that, of course, is like it's a post facto value, right? By the time the incident has happened, something bad has already taken place. You are reacting as fast as you possibly can. There's certainly some value to that, of course, but there's also value to prevention, and prevention is difficult, but it's certainly not impossible. But coming back to the value of on-call, there's a set of people who believe that the primary value of SRE lies in on-call and on-call related activities. I will say, if you believe that the primary value of SRE lies in on-call, then you're ignoring the vast difference you can make in preventative measures, design phase contributions, so on and so forth. And those tend to be the most tightly defended areas of the SDLC because it overlaps so much with feature engineers. And there's a social hierarchy there. But if you also assert that on-call has no value, or that the bulk of the value resides in the other things, then that also has some problems. Basically, if you say that either side of that dichotomy is more important than the other, I think we have some obvious problems with that. And I don't think we successfully understand this or successfully value this as an industry. I think in particular, the value of on-call for the industry is simultaneously, by engineering leaders primarily, right? But it's simultaneously incredibly valued and incredibly unvalued. And that dichotomy has to be resolved at some point, or at least we have to come to a better understanding of it. Finally, to take an even kind of wider view in some sense, thinking about things within the profession, I think we have an upcoming task to really integrate the different approaches to how we do post-incident response, particularly the safety 1 and safety 2 cultures, which I won't attempt to describe in detail here, but I will say that the great advantage of the safety 1 mechanisms and culture is that it fits quite well within an existing kind of hierarchical system, however you want to put that. And even though questions about how meaningful MTTR and so on and so forth actually are very meaningful questions, and we can very seriously criticize what a metrics-based approach to incident response and postmortems look like. The flip side of that is that if we avoid the metrics, if we are unable to say things which are useful within an executive context to the executives about how they should react to incidents, we are going to struggle to get these things adopted in general and to meaningfully affect change in our systems and organizations. For me, I think I struggle with this more because I speak to executives trying to do better incident response in their organizations, and it's not necessarily a concern for everyone, for sure. But I will say that some kind of integration here awaits us, and we really need to resolve this in order to push forward this dimension of what SRE does. What is our role with respect to managing the machines that manage society? I think in our ethical work, we've tended to focus on equity, representation, diversity, inclusion, all of that good stuff in the past. And to be clear, much as the companies that we in general work for have prioritized things. But it's becoming clearer to me, I suppose, that as we accelerate into an era of kind of stronger, more concentrated corporate control with a burning planet, global epidemic, so on and so forth, that SRE needs to stand for something other than just being the people who make the extractive machinery work more extractively, work faster, more efficient. Do we need a controlled profession? Do we need entry criteria? Do we need a topic which has been raised a lot of times with respect to software engineering? Do we need some kind of professional standards? Do we need a whistleblower's charter? A funding agency? These questions, I think we also would benefit from treating in detail before they become more acute than they already are. But I think one thing that occasionally bothers me is the fact that SRE itself, as a profession, as wonderful as it is, and it is wonderful, and I love it, I love you all, is a very pragmatic profession. It's in some sense a deeply conservative profession at the end of the day. It's very strongly practically oriented, and as a result, it's hard to get time for the practitioners to actually fundamentally push things forward which are very theoretical or seen not to have immediate business value. And I think that's a huge pity, because there are so many unanswered questions, and there's so many things that could be of benefit to other people if we did them. But I think we are not well set up as a profession and how we are organized today to really tackle these questions. And I think it's urgent to do something about that as more or less as soon as possible. That in itself is an issue. And I don't think we can necessarily rely on the large companies with, in theory, time and money to spare to do this for us. Should we? So my call to action is quite simple. We need to address these questions, we need to move on from the book, and we need to start as soon as possible. And we might even need to think of new ways to organize ourselves so that this kind of work can be done. That's fine. In fact, arguably it's necessary. But I think we need to do it. And so if you are interested in doing this, if you are interested in not missing the wood for the trees, then I would urge you to reach out and make yourself known, so we can build a coalition and move forward and make things better for the profession and for the billions of people that we reach with our work every day. It's vital. Thank you for your time and attention.